The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. The kind of stillness that made every footstep echo louder, every cough feel out of place. People barely whispered, eyes shifting toward the entrance, unsure why they felt so tense. No one had expected much from the day's first case, a homeless man arrested for loitering and disturbing the peace outside a downtown cafe. Cases like that came and went like traffic. But something about this one was different. Maybe it was the way the court officer double-checked the paperwork, or how the bailiff cleared his throat 3 times before announcing the defendant's name. And then he said it, James Randall. Silence. It was as if that name carried weight none of them were ready for. The judge, who had been casually reviewing documents on the bench, suddenly looked up. His expression changed. First confusion. Then something deeper, recognition. Pain. Respect. It was hard to tell. But it was clear something shifted in the room. Moments later, the courtroom doors creaked open and in walked a man who looked like life had done its best to break him. James wore a weathered army jacket 2 sizes too big, his boots worn down to threads, his hair graying at the edges, face rough from weeks, maybe months, without a proper shave or sleep. He didn't look like someone who belonged in that room. He looked like he didn't belong anywhere. The officer escorting him didn't bother with cuffs. That alone said a lot. James walked slowly, a quiet dignity in his steps, as if the years on the street hadn't crushed the soldier still living inside him. A few people in the gallery squinted, as if trying to place him, like his face stirred a memory they couldn't quite reach. He didn't glance at the audience. He didn't speak. Just stood behind the defense table, eyes fixed ahead. The prosecutor, a young man new to the courtroom circuit, shuffled nervously through his notes, probably wondering why everyone else had gone quiet. He leaned over to whisper to his assistant, and she subtly shook her head. "That's James Randall," she mouthed. He didn't get it. Not yet. The judge finally spoke, his voice steadier than his hands. "Mr. Randall. I'd like to confirm you're representing yourself today." James nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was low but clear. No arrogance, no defiance, just honesty. The kind that hit harder than any loud declaration. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Let the record show the defendant has waived counsel. Proceed." As the trial began, the charges seemed almost laughable. Loitering. Resisting removal. Disturbing the peace. According to the report, James had refused to move from outside a cafe where he'd been quietly sitting. When police approached, he had asked, calmly, according to one officer, for 5 more minutes. Just 5 minutes. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't stolen a thing. But he hadn't left either. That's what got him here. The prosecutor read the charges like it was any other file, but the more he spoke, the more he started to fumble. Words tripped over themselves. His argument seemed to collapse mid-sentence. He was distracted, unsure. The courtroom still hadn't returned to normal. People were sitting straighter. Leaning forward. Watching James, not the lawyer. And then, a man in the back row slowly stood up. No one knew why. He was older, dressed in a dark coat, hat pressed to his chest. He didn't say a word. Then another stood. A woman near the aisle. Her eyes locked on James. She looked like she wanted to cry. One by one, they rose. Dozens. Maybe more. Veterans, by the look of them. Civilians too. young and old. No one instructed them. No signal was given. But the entire courtroom rose silently, their eyes fixed on the man in the weathered army jacket. The judge paused mid-sentence, looked around, then back at James. "Do you know why they're standing?" he asked, not accusingly, but gently. Almost as if asking himself. James didn't answer. He didn't need to. The judge leaned forward. "You served in Fallujah, didn't you?" A slow nod. "You were with the 3rd Battalion. You were injured, twice." James nodded again. "You received a Silver Star," the judge said, voice dropping a little. "And a Purple Heart." No one moved. Even the prosecutor froze. James didn't smile. Didn't posture. Just stood there like he had nothing left to prove. And that's when the weight of the moment sank in. This wasn't just some random man caught up in another petty charge. This was someone who had given everything, seen the worst of humanity, and had come home to find nothing waiting for him. No support. No system to catch him when he fell. No place to rest. And now he was on trial. For sitting outside a cafe too long. The judge took off his glasses, set them on the bench, and looked directly at James. "Mr. Randall, I think there's a story here that hasn't been told yet. And I'd like to hear it. All of it." But before James could speak, a soft cough came from the gallery. A woman stepped forward from the back row, nervous, eyes red-rimmed. She held something in her hands. A letter. Folded neatly, stained with time. Her voice shook. "My brother served with him," she said. "He saved my brother's life." The judge blinked. James finally turned, slowly, his face registering something like surprise. The woman stepped closer, holding the letter like a flag. "My brother didn't come home. But he wrote about James. About how, if anything ever happened to him, James Randall was the reason some of their unit did come back." The courtroom was silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy with tension, it was heavy with truth. The kind no charge sheet could hold. And just as James looked like he might speak, just as he drew in a breath to finally tell his side, a uniformed figure appeared at the door. A general. Not retired. Active duty. He stepped into the courtroom without a word, the medals on his chest glinting in the light, the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten. His eyes found James immediately. And he saluted. Not a casual nod. Not a friendly gesture. A full, formal salute. James didn't move at first. Then, after a moment, he returned it. The courtroom watched in stunned silence, the air thick with everything unsaid. The judge looked down at the papers in front of him again, simple charges, made meaningless now. And still, the story hadn't truly begun. Because behind those tired eyes, behind that name that carried silent weight, was a truth no one in the room had fully grasped yet. But they would. They were about to. The courtroom remained silent, suspended in that strange in-between where time feels slower, where everyone's breath seems caught in the same invisible grip. The general didn't speak, and neither did James. But something passed between them, some weight of memory, of shared pain and unspoken honor. Even the judge, despite decades on the bench, looked unsure of how to proceed. He cleared his throat, trying to ground the moment. "General," he said carefully, "you're welcome to speak if you have something to add to this hearing." The general finally stepped forward, slow and deliberate, stopping just inside the courtroom rail. "Your Honor," he said in a firm but respectful tone, "I'm not here to interfere. I'm here because I owe this man more than words can explain. A hushed gasp moved through the gallery. The judge gave a slow nod, not asking for more, not just yet. Instead, he turned his attention back to James. Mr. Randall, perhaps you can help us understand how we got here today. James's jaw tensed. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him. I didn't come looking for trouble, he said. I just needed somewhere to sit for a few minutes. Somewhere quiet. Why that cafe? The prosecutor asked, a little more gently this time. James looked at him. It used to be a bookstore. Back before I deployed. I used to go there with my wife. His voice cracked ever so slightly on the last word. She passed 2 years ago. The courtroom shifted. Even those who hadn't known his name until today could feel the weight behind his words. He didn't say it for sympathy. He said it because it was true. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Randall, we don't always know how someone ends up homeless. But I'd like to understand how you did. James hesitated. Then he nodded. I served 3 tours. The last one was the hardest. I lost half my team in one night. We were hit in the middle of a recon op. The Humvee flipped. I dragged one of my men out under fire, but the others, there was nothing left to drag. He paused. His eyes stared forward, but they weren't seeing the courtroom anymore. I came home with a busted leg, a damaged spine, and nightmares that don't leave. My wife held me together as long as she could. But when she got sick, everything unraveled. I tried getting help. VA appointments months out. Paperwork stacked to the ceiling. They called me a hero, but treated me like a burden. No one interrupted. No one dared. After she died, he continued, I couldn't keep up with bills. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't hold a job. One day I woke up in a park, and that was the start of it. You think it's just temporary. You think you'll figure it out. But time moves faster than you, and before you know it, people stop seeing you at all. His voice was calm, eerily so, but every word struck something deep in the room. Even the prosecutor, who had walked in expecting to check off a simple case before lunch, couldn't lift his eyes from the man standing across from him. The judge sat back. And what about the name? He asked. You go by James Randall. But that wasn't the name on your service file. James didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. I stopped using my full name after I got out. Randall's my middle name. I didn't want to be found. Didn't want people asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. The general finally spoke again. Your Honor, that's why I'm here today. Because he might have tried to disappear, but he never stopped being a hero. The judge gestured for him to continue. I first met Sergeant James T. Randall during a joint task force operation overseas. I was a captain then. Young, arrogant. Thought I knew everything. My team got ambushed on a back route outside Kandahar. We were outgunned, pinned down. I was injured, badly. James disobeyed a direct order, broke through enemy lines, and pulled me out himself. Risked his life for mine. I tried to thank him later, and he just said, it's what we're trained to do, sir. He didn't take the medal seriously. But I wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for him. The judge didn't speak. Neither did anyone else. You could feel it, the shift in understanding. That this wasn't just a man on trial. This was a man abandoned after giving his all. The prosecutor slowly set down his notes. Your Honor, he said carefully, may I request a short recess? I believe I need time to reconsider how we're approaching this case. The judge nodded slowly, eyes still on James. Granted. 10-minute recess. But even after the gavel tapped once, no one moved. The entire room remained on edge, the air still filled with the raw truth just exposed. It was no longer about loitering or disturbing the peace. This was a deeper indictment, of how society often forgets the ones who fought for it. As James quietly returned to his seat, a woman in the gallery, a young nurse by the look of her, passed a folded napkin to the court officer, who handed it to him. James looked at it, puzzled, and opened it. Inside was a note, written in a hurried hand, "You saved my uncle. He talked about you until the day he died. You're not forgotten." He blinked, held the napkin gently, then tucked it into his pocket. The general turned to leave, but before stepping out, he looked back at James and nodded once more, a promise in his eyes. Outside the courtroom, reporters were already gathering. Word had spread. A homeless veteran. A courtroom standing in silence. A general in full uniform saluting a man society had ignored. Something powerful was unfolding, and people were starting to notice. But inside, where the real weight still hung, James sat alone. No lawyers, no family, no press attention. Just a quiet man waiting to be judged. And that's where the story paused. Because what came next would not only decide his future, it would shine a spotlight on how many others like him were left in the shadows. And one question still lingered in the air. Would the system see him now? Or forget him again? 10 minutes passed like an hour. James sat there, his eyes steady on the table as murmurs floated around him. The courtroom slowly refilled, yet somehow it felt even quieter than before. The tension hadn't broken, it had only gotten heavier. The judge returned to the bench, followed by the prosecutor, now wearing a more thoughtful expression than he had before the recess. People could tell something had shifted, but no one was sure what would come of it. James noticed the nurse again, now seated in the back row. She gave him a slight nod, as if reminding him that someone out there still believed in him. He gave a faint nod back, but inside he felt the weight of every uncertain moment since the day he left the army. No matter who spoke for him today, it was still his name on that docket. And homeless or not, his fate would be decided here. Across the aisle, a quiet conversation was happening between the prosecutor and a man who had just arrived in a sharp suit with a small folder tucked under his arm. He wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't military either. He was from the Department of Veterans Affairs. His presence added a new layer to the story. Now it wasn't just about what James had done, but also about what the system hadn't. The prosecutor addressed the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to request that Mr. Grayson from the VA be allowed to speak briefly. He may have information relevant to this case. The judge agreed, and the man stepped forward. My name is Alan Grayson, Regional Case Liaison with the VA. I reviewed Mr. Randall's file this morning after receiving an alert from General Matthews. What I found disturbed me. Mr. Randall was supposed to receive benefits beginning 2 years ago, disability, mental health support, and housing assistance. But somewhere in the system, his paperwork got flagged and delayed. James looked up at that. It was the first time he'd heard anyone acknowledge what he'd been shouting into the void for years. Grayson continued, after that, a change of address and a failure to confirm identity led to his file being closed. Essentially, the system lost him. He's not the only one, unfortunately. Cases like this aren't common, but they do happen. And when they do, they leave people like Mr. Randall slipping through the cracks. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward. "You're telling me the government failed to provide a decorated veteran with the support he was promised?" the judge asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and disappointment. "Yes, sir," Grayson replied. "And I'm here today to say the VA is reopening his case immediately." But James wasn't nodding or smiling. His expression hadn't changed. Because while that sounded like progress, it didn't erase the nights he spent under bridges. It didn't erase the times he was called a nuisance, a beggar, or worse. It didn't bring back the years he'd lost in silence. As Grayson returned to his seat, the judge took a deep breath. "Mr. Randall, would you like to say anything before we continue?" James stood slowly, carefully, as if every joint had to remember how. He faced the court, but didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was calm but firm. "I appreciate what's being done now. But none of this changes what already happened. I don't want pity. I don't even need a medal. I just want the truth to matter. Not just for me, but for every guy out there sleeping in an alley tonight, wondering if anyone still sees them." People were quiet again. Not because they were unsure what to say, but because he was right. In the gallery, another subplot quietly unfolded. The young nurse pulled out her phone and began texting. She wasn't the kind of person who normally used social media to stir things up, but something about this moment felt different. She posted a short clip she had recorded of James speaking, along with a simple caption, "This is what a forgotten hero looks like." Within minutes, it began to spread. Meanwhile, the prosecutor was struggling. On one hand, this was a simple loitering case. On the other, it was now a public reckoning. And beneath it all was a deeper question: how does a system reconcile with a man it discarded? The judge paused the proceedings again, calling both attorneys to the bench. They spoke in low tones, then returned to their places. But before the judge could proceed, the courtroom doors opened once more. An older woman stepped inside. She was clearly nervous, clutching a small framed photo to her chest. James didn't recognize her. But when she stepped forward and addressed the judge, everything took another turn. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I wasn't sure if I should come today. But I had to. My son served with Sergeant Randall. He was one of the ones who didn't make it home." She turned to James. "You wrote me a letter after it happened. You told me how he died saving others. I never forgot that. And I've kept your letter for 10 years. I want to say thank you. And I want everyone here to know that my son thought you were the bravest man he ever knew." James's lips parted, but no words came out. He sat back down, blinking back something that had been buried a long time. The judge leaned back, clearly weighing more than just a legal decision. There was the question of justice, but also the question of dignity. And how, in moments like these, the two don't always follow the same path. Outside, reporters had picked up the nurse's video. It was already going viral. The phrase, "homeless hero," was trending. Strangers were asking for his name, his story. Veterans groups were mobilizing. A few were even gathered outside the courthouse. Back inside, James remained composed, but inside his thoughts swirled. How had his life come to this? A name forgotten. A system that turned its back. And now, strangers fighting for him when it might already be too late to get back what was lost. Still, something was changing. The silence that used to follow him down every street, through every shelter line, that silence was being broken. The judge tapped his gavel once more. "Mr. Randall," he said carefully, "we are still in the middle of a legal process. But I assure you, this courtroom sees you now. And what happens next will not be treated lightly." But what would happen next? Would James walk free, or would the weight of bureaucracy still drag him down? Would the attention outside turn into real action, or fade the moment the cameras stopped rolling? And most of all, was the rising of the courtroom just a symbolic gesture, or the start of something real? The answers, like James's future, still hung in the balance. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Every person sitting inside, whether they had walked in by chance, by duty, or by choice, was now part of something bigger than a legal proceeding. James Randall, the homeless veteran who'd once led soldiers through danger and loss, now stood at the center of a storm that had become impossible to ignore. The judge's voice echoed with both legal weight and personal reflection, but his next words didn't come right away. He seemed torn, his hands resting still on the bench, his eyes fixed on James as though searching for something deeper than the facts in front of him. Outside, the temperature had dropped, but the crowd was growing. Word had spread. Veterans. Reporters. Curious bystanders. Even local officials were beginning to arrive, unsure of what had sparked such attention in a routine courtroom but unwilling to miss what felt like a turning point. It wasn't just a trending story anymore. It had become a reflection of something long ignored: what happens when a country forgets the very people it once asked everything from. Inside, James sat motionless, but his mind wasn't quiet. He replayed the faces of his old unit. Men who didn't make it. Men who did, but never made it back emotionally. He thought about his mother, long gone now, and how she always believed he'd come home a hero. Instead, he'd returned to eviction notices, job interviews that turned cold when he mentioned PTSD, and nights where the silence of the street felt louder than any battlefield. He tried not to wonder if this was too little, too late. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I believe we need to consider the broader context of this case. While the charges before us are technically valid, they do not reflect the full truth. Mr. Randall's circumstances are not simply about criminal behavior, they are about institutional neglect." James glanced over at him. That was the first time the man had called him anything other than the defendant. It was subtle, but something in the prosecutor's tone had softened, as if this case had forced him to see the man beyond the paperwork. The judge looked down at the folder in front of him. Then he looked up again. "Mr. Randall, I have reviewed your military record. I've seen the citations, the commendations, and the sacrifices. I've also seen the incident reports from your recent years, disturbances, loitering, petty charges. But I don't see a man who's dangerous. I see someone who has been let down repeatedly." James didn't flinch. He just waited. Still unsure if this sympathy was about to come with more handcuffs or not. Then the judge continued. "But this is still a court of law. We must consider precedent, public policy, and fairness to all parties involved." The tension in the room ratcheted up again. Everyone felt it. A moment like this could swing in either direction. Some believed the judge was preparing to dismiss the charges. Others feared he might take a more cautious route, worried that leniency would set a precedent for others. James could feel the invisible line between compassion and consequence tightening around him. Just then, the courtroom doors opened once more. This time, it was a tall man in civilian clothes with a military posture that couldn't be hidden. He stepped in quietly but with purpose. His gaze immediately found James. Their eyes locked for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. It was Colonel Harris. James hadn't seen him in nearly a decade. He'd been the commanding officer overseas during James's final tour. No one had heard from him in years. Most assumed he'd retired to some quiet place far from the noise. But now he stood at the back of the courtroom, holding something small in his hand, James's old unit insignia, framed and worn with time. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Sir, do you have business with the court?" Colonel Harris stepped forward slowly. "Your Honor, I wasn't called here. I came on my own. I saw the footage this morning, the one that's been circulating. I recognized Sergeant Randall. I served with him. I watched him lead men into combat and pull them out when it didn't seem possible. I watched him sacrifice himself to protect lives, not just of our unit, but of civilians in an enemy-held zone. You're deciding what to do with this man based on one bad day in a bank lobby. I suggest you consider the 100 good days he gave his country before that." The room was still. The nurse from before wiped a tear from her cheek. Even the clerk at the side of the courtroom seemed moved. The prosecutor said nothing. He just listened. Because for the first time in the case, something had happened that couldn't be found in any file or court document. It was human. It was undeniable. The judge looked over his glasses and down at James once again. "Mr. Randall, you have many people speaking on your behalf today. But I need to know something directly from you." James nodded slightly. "Ask me anything. If this case is dismissed, what will you do next?" James paused. It wasn't a simple answer. He hadn't planned a next. Not for a long time. But now, for the first time in years, the idea felt real. "I'll find a job. I'll find a way to live under a roof again. But more than that, I'll try to make sure no one else who wore the uniform ends up like I did. Invisible." The judge leaned back, taking it in. The room seemed to freeze, the silence louder than it had ever been. Outside, the voices of the crowd began to rise, chanting something that had started small but was now echoing through the courthouse steps, "Justice for James." Everyone waited. For the words that would determine what kind of story this would become, a redemption, or another forgotten file in a broken system. And in that moment, James didn't know which way it would go. He only knew that for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He had people, strangers, soldiers, even former enemies of the system, standing in his corner. But still, the verdict hadn't come. And until it did, the weight of every second felt like a lifetime. The judge leaned forward, just about to speak, when a sudden, unexpected sound interrupted the silence, a soft buzz from his clerk's phone. She picked it up quickly, her eyes scanning the screen, and then her face went pale. Without a word, she stood and whispered something in the judge's ear. He blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting whatever she had just told him. His brow furrowed deeply as he nodded slightly and signaled for a brief recess. People in the courtroom exchanged puzzled glances. The tension that had just built to a peak now shifted into confusion. Even Colonel Harris seemed unsure of what had just happened. James sat still, but his heart had picked up pace. He knew enough to recognize when something wasn't right. Whatever message had come through that phone had changed everything. When the judge returned after several minutes, his expression had shifted, still serious, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. He cleared his throat, and the room hushed instantly. "It seems we've received an urgent development," he said carefully. "Something related to the identity of Mr. Randall." A murmur spread like wildfire across the room. James turned slightly, confused. His identity? He hadn't hidden anything. What could possibly be new? The judge gestured to the clerk, who now carried a manila envelope. She placed it on the bench in front of him. This arrived via secure courier from the Department of Defense, the judge continued. It appears classified records pertaining to Sergeant Randall's final deployment have just been declassified, ahead of schedule. James's stomach dropped. I don't understand, he said aloud. The judge opened the folder, scanned a few lines, and looked directly at James. Mr. Randall, were you aware that your final mission, one that was officially reported as unsuccessful, was actually a covert success that led to the recovery of a high-value intelligence target? The room gasped. Even Colonel Harris looked stunned. James blinked. No. I was told we were extracted because the op failed. That's not what these documents say, the judge replied, holding up a summary sheet. According to this, your actions directly led to the neutralization of a known terror cell. In fact, your final act, sacrificing your extraction point to cover your team, allowed for the capture of a target connected to multiple international plots. That's why the original files were sealed. James's hands started to tremble. His memory of that day had always been foggy. He had been injured during the mission, knocked unconscious before evac. He remembered the firefight, the chaos, the smoke. But no one had ever told him they completed the mission. All he'd ever received was a discharge and a silence that felt like shame. But why release this now? Colonel Harris asked, his voice tight with unease. The judge hesitated. Because someone petitioned for it. An anonymous request was filed just days ago, arguing that the truth about Sergeant Randall's service was relevant to his current legal standing. That request was approved less than 12 hours ago. The room buzzed with whispers. James turned to Colonel Harris, but the man shook his head. It wasn't me, he said. But I wish it had been. James's mind raced. Who could have done it? He had no family left. No connections. Who even knew about that mission, enough to push for this? Before he could speak, the courtroom doors opened once again. A woman stepped in. She wore a formal black coat and walked with quiet authority. Her hair was pulled back, and she looked directly at James with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He stood instinctively, not recognizing her at first. But something in her eyes was familiar. Mr. Randall, the judge said, this is Agent Melanie Reyes. She's with military intelligence. She filed the request to unseal your records. James stared at her. Why? How do you even know me? She stepped forward. Because my brother was on your unit. Corporal Daniel Reyes. He died on your last mission. You carried his body out under fire, then refused to leave until everyone else was clear. I never forgot your name. I followed your record. And when I saw your arrest on the news, I knew the public only had part of the story. Her voice cracked just slightly, but she kept going. You were a hero that day, James. My brother died, yes, but because of you, 5 others lived. Including a young soldier who now trains medics. That matters. You shouldn't be sitting in this courtroom like a criminal. The air in the courtroom changed. The weight of her words sank in slowly, like water filling a well. Even the jury members seemed shaken. James didn't know what to say. He had lived for years thinking the mission had been a failure. That all he had to show for it were nightmares and aching limbs. And now, standing before him, was the sister of a man he tried so hard to save, telling him he had mattered more than he ever knew. The judge took a deep breath. Given this new information, we'll need to reconsider the entire framing of this case. But just then, another voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. A man in a tailored suit, standing next to a cameraman. "Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm with the National Investigative News Channel. We've just been granted permission to release a story we've been working on regarding VA mismanagement in Sergeant Randall's case. The report will air nationwide this evening." The judge blinked in disbelief. "What does that have to do with today's proceedings?" The reporter held up a flash drive. "It contains evidence that Mr. Randall's disability benefits were wrongfully denied due to a bureaucratic oversight, one that was flagged, ignored, and later covered up. We believe it played a direct role in his descent into homelessness." The courtroom nearly exploded. It was no longer just a trial. It was a reckoning. James looked at the flash drive like it was a grenade, one that had just landed in the center of everything. Agent Reyes nodded. "I've seen the same files. He was eligible for support years ago. But someone buried it." Now the conflict wasn't just about James's past. It was about how many other veterans might be out there, forgotten, misfiled, misjudged. James wasn't just a case anymore. He was a symbol. The judge stood, his voice firm now. "This court will take a recess until tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'm ordering a full review of these claims, both from the Department of Veterans Affairs and Military Intelligence. Sergeant Randall, you are temporarily released on your own recognizance." James didn't move. He couldn't. His heart pounded as the room dissolved into a storm of movement and emotion. His name was no longer just a case file or a whispered scandal. It was a headline. It was a question mark. It was a challenge to every broken promise made to those who served. And as the courtroom emptied, one thought kept echoing in his mind: someone fought for me. But he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Because the truth had just started to unravel, and someone out there wasn't ready for the world to know what had been buried for years. The next morning, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters lined the walls, cameras clicked softly, and every seat was filled. Word had spread fast. A homeless veteran, once forgotten, now stood at the center of a storm that reached far beyond his case. James Randall walked in slowly, not with pride, but with a quiet steadiness. He wore the same old boots, the same worn coat. But something in his posture had changed. He stood a little taller now, like the weight on his shoulders had shifted. The judge entered, his expression unreadable. He wasted no time. After reviewing all submitted evidence, including the newly released military records and VA documentation, this court finds that Mr. James Randall was wrongfully denied benefits and unjustly criminalized. The charges related to the incident at the pharmacy are hereby dismissed with prejudice. A wave of gasps swept through the room. James's mouth parted slightly, stunned. Colonel Harris, seated just behind him, let out a sigh that sounded almost like relief. But the judge wasn't finished. This case, however, has raised deeper concerns. We have learned that not only was Mr. Randall's service misrepresented, but a systemic pattern of negligence may have led to multiple veterans falling through the cracks. He paused, tapping a file on the bench. "I've referred this matter to federal authorities for further investigation." The courtroom stirred. Reporters began to scribble notes faster. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Randall, your case is closed. But your story may have just opened something far bigger." James felt everything around him blur for a moment. He wasn't just walking away free. He was walking out as proof of a system that failed. And now the system had to answer for it. As he turned to leave, applause began quietly in the back. At first it was just a few veterans, old men and women in faded uniforms, clapping with restraint. But then it grew louder. Stronger. Soon the entire room was on its feet, clapping not just for James, but for every soldier who'd ever been silenced by red tape and forgotten after the war ended. James didn't wave. He just nodded once, fighting the tightness in his throat. Outside, the media lights flashed. Microphones reached for him. But before he could speak, Agent Reyes stepped up beside him and whispered, "Come with me. There's something else you need to see." He followed her to a quiet parking lot where a black SUV waited. In the back seat sat a man in a dark gray suit. He stepped out slowly, and James immediately noticed the silver star on his lapel. It was a 4-star general, someone he never expected to meet. "Sergeant Randall," the man said, offering a hand. "General Voss. I reviewed your mission file personally last night." James shook his hand, unsure what to say. "I've authorized something I rarely do," the general continued. "You've been reinstated with full honors. Retroactive. Your record is corrected. Your benefits are restored. And you've been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for actions during Operation Ash Gate." James couldn't speak. He stared at the small velvet box the general handed him, barely able to close his fingers around it. "We failed you," the general added softly. "But I promise you, that failure ends here." James looked down at the medal, then up at the man. "I never wanted glory. I just wanted to feel like what we did mattered." "It did," the general said. "And it still does." As they drove off, Reyes looked at him and smiled gently. "You thought you were invisible. But someone was watching. People like you remind the world what sacrifice really means." James nodded. But just as they turned a corner, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and the color drained from her face. "What is it?" James asked. Reyes turned the phone toward him. It was a still image, grainy security footage from a government archive. It showed a man in military gear walking alone through a compound. His face wasn't clear. But the timestamp and location were unmistakable. It was the same mission where James believed Daniel Reyes had died. "This can't be real," she whispered. James leaned closer. "That's Daniel?" She didn't answer. Her fingers tapped the screen, pulling up an encrypted message sent just hours ago. The sender? Unknown. The message? He's alive. And someone's been hiding him. James stared at her in shock. "They told us he died. I carried his tags. I buried him." Reyes looked up, voice shaky. "Or someone wanted you to believe that. Maybe Daniel wasn't just a soldier. Maybe he knew something. Something someone didn't want getting out." A long silence filled the car. The moment that was supposed to bring closure had just opened a deeper mystery. James tightened his grip on the metal in his hand. "Then we're not done." Reyes nodded slowly. "No. We're just getting started." And as they drove into the falling dusk, the questions multiplied. Why had Daniel's death been faked? Who had sent the message? And if someone went to such lengths to erase the truth before, what would they do now that the truth was starting to surface? James had fought for survival. Now, he would fight for answers. Not just for himself, but for the brother-in-arms he thought he lost. And this time, he wasn't alone. James sat quietly in the back of the SUV, staring down at the photo on Agent Reyes's phone. The blurred figure in military gear looked like a ghost pulled from memory. He had carried Daniel's tags for years, convinced he'd watched his brother-in-arms die. But now, faced with the impossible, he wasn't sure what to feel. Hope, confusion, guilt, they all swirled in his chest like a storm with no center. Reyes didn't say much. She gave him space, understanding that sometimes silence does more than words ever could. They spent the next few days combing through encrypted military channels, old files, and redacted reports. Reyes had access that James never dreamed of, but even with all her clearance, they kept hitting walls. Names blacked out. Missions sealed under layers of bureaucracy. Every lead they chased seemed to vanish right when it got close. But James had learned something important from his years on the street: when official doors closed, sometimes the truth was still hiding in plain sight. He asked to visit a retired colonel who had served with their unit, a man named Callahan, now living in a small cabin up north. Callahan opened the door slowly, eyes narrowing as he recognized the man standing before him. "Randall," he said. "I thought you were, well, hell. Come on in." Over steaming cups of bitter black coffee, Callahan sat across from him at a scarred wooden table. He didn't talk like an officer anymore. Time had softened his edges. But when James asked about Daniel, Callahan's eyes hardened again. "You weren't supposed to see that footage," Callahan said flatly. "And if you're smart, you'll stop digging." "I saw it," James replied, voice steady. "And I'm not stopping." Callahan stared at him for a long time. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Daniel didn't die in that explosion. He was pulled out by a shadow unit, deep black ops. They said he had information that couldn't be allowed to go public. Something about what we really did out there." "What did we do?" James asked, the question trembling in the air like a wire about to snap. Callahan shook his head. "You were a good soldier. You followed orders. That's all they wanted you to do. But Daniel," he started asking questions. "He wanted to leak what he saw. So they made him disappear." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. All those years of carrying guilt, all the nightmares, all the questions, none of them came close to this. "So he's alive. Somewhere." Callahan nodded slowly. "Last I heard, he was moved to a secure facility under a false identity. But if someone's sending you messages now, it means someone else wants him found." Back in the SUV, James sat with Reyes and repeated every word. Her face was pale, jaw tight. If Daniel knows what they were covering up, he might be in danger. Real danger. That same night, Reyes received another message from the same anonymous source. Coordinates. A time. A note that simply read, "He's waiting." They drove through the night, following back roads through wooded terrain until they reached a secluded cabin tucked in the foothills. It was nearly dawn when they arrived, and the air was still, like the world itself was holding its breath. James stepped out first, heart pounding. He approached the cabin door slowly, each footstep heavier than the last. He knocked once. No answer. Then the door creaked open, and there he was, older, thinner, his beard now streaked with gray. But it was him. Daniel. Alive. Neither of them spoke right away. There was nothing to say. They just stared at each other, two brothers not bound by blood but by something deeper, shared fire, shared ghosts. Finally, James broke the silence. "They told me you died." "They needed you to believe that," Daniel replied quietly. "Because if you knew the truth, you'd ask questions." James nodded. "I'm here now. So tell me." Over the next few hours, Daniel told them everything. The mission had been a cover. They hadn't just been sent to dismantle a weapons lab, they'd been sent to erase evidence of an illegal operation involving unauthorized tests. Daniel had seen civilians caught in the crossfire. Innocent lives lost. He tried to report it, but the higher-ups buried it. When he kept pushing, they staged his death and moved him to a secure location, labeled him a risk to national interest. "I've been living off the grid for 10 years, Daniel said. "Every day I thought about coming out. But I didn't want them coming after my family, or you." James sat in stunned silence. But then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the medal the general had given him. "They gave me this," he said. "Tried to make it right." Daniel looked at it, eyes unreadable. "It's not about medals anymore. It's about truth." Later that day, Reyes made a decision. She helped Daniel upload his testimony and the classified documents he'd secretly stored to a secure whistleblower network. Within hours, it began spreading, picked up by major outlets. The truth, long buried, was finally being told. The fallout was immediate. Hearings were called. Investigations launched. Some denied knowledge. Others resigned. But more importantly, the story sparked something in the public. Veterans began to share their own stories. Whistleblowers from other operations came forward. The country, for a moment, stopped to really listen. As for James, he didn't return to the street. He accepted a job with a local veteran outreach center, helping other homeless veterans find housing and support. His case had inspired policy changes that fast-tracked resources for at-risk veterans. Daniel, though still cautious, began to slowly rebuild a life of his own, with support, security, and a promise that he would never be silenced again. Months later, the two brothers sat on a park bench beneath a fading autumn sky. James looked at Daniel and said, "We lost so much. But maybe now, others won't have to." Daniel nodded. "What we did, it mattered. Even if no one knew it at the time." And as the wind rustled the leaves and the world moved on around them, there was peace, not the kind that comes with silence, but the kind that comes after being heard. Because in the end, this wasn't just about one homeless veteran or one broken system. It was about the fight for dignity, the cost of truth, and the power of standing up, even when you've got nothing left but your name. And when James Randall stood up, the whole courtroom rose, because sometimes, one man's truth is all it takes to wake up the world.